My name is Jerry Lynn Ward, and I'm an attorney practicing in Texas. I'm also the hostess of this podcast, Justice in His Kingdom. The podcast will cover a broad range of topics that are related to the issue of justice. Of course, the term justice will be defined in accordance with God's law. I'm very proud today to have a podcast entitled The Tragedy of American Relations with Hispanic America, and to have as a guest someone who knows intimately the culture, the people, and the institutions of Hispanic America. And what I'm talking about is, of course, everything south of the Rio Grande River. So I want to introduce Roger Oliver. And Roger is a missionary in Mexico who has intimate knowledge not only of Mexico but of other Hispanic American countries in which he has served. He understands the cultures and the institutions and has immersed himself in the study of those, particularly with regard to Mexico. He and his wife Marcy run the Pierre Viret Learning Center, which is a Christian academy serving preschool through high school. They also sponsor a webpage, www.visionamericalatina.com, in order to promote Christian Reconstruction in Latin America. Roger retired from the Army in 1992 and has an MBA at Syracuse University for the Army and has completed a Master's in Theology and Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary. And before we get into this, let me explain a little bit what we are going to talk about. We are going to address justice as it pertains to foreign affairs between nations and how nations should act justly with respect to adherence to God's law in that area of life. And to do this, we will be visiting the story of American relations with Hispanic America and the origins and attitudes and presuppositions that North Americans have held in the exercise of those affairs and policies. We will discuss the application of God's definition of justice and the tragic failures in this story. We will apply those lessons that should have been learned to present affairs. Roger, thank you so much for joining me, and I would like you to tell the folks a little bit about what your mission is in Mexico at the present time.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, you already mentioned the Learning Center and the web page, and we're trying to do some podcasts. The young men that work with me are very good at pulling that together. And of course, the purpose is to plant a mustard seed that will build the intellectual foundations of the future Christian civilization in Mexico. That's what we write as our goal, what we're shooting at. We're not going to see the harvest of that, but we're planting the seeds and watering the plants.
Well, why don't you tell the folks what other countries you have lived in Hispanic America doing mission work?
Uh-huh. Well, I guess you could call the Army, wherever a Christian goes, he's a missionary. So I was stationed in Panama for 4 years and in Honduras for 3. The Army sent me to the Defense Language Institute to study Spanish, and I grew up in Southern California, so I've been exposed to the language all my life and the culture. I've been to Colombia, to Peru, Ecuador, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay to visit. I don't know that that qualifies me as an expert per se, but I do have a gut feeling and have read quite a bit and have made my own conclusions. Not everybody's going to agree with me, but as it's influenced the way I do missions in Mexico.
Well, one thing that I just talked about is how you are familiar with the institutions and particularly of Mexico, and you run a
Hmm.
school there, and of course the government has its own ideas about education, and so do many of the people because of some unfortunate events that have taken place in the last, say, 150 years. So, can you
Hmm.
tell the folks what your experience has been with the control that the Mexican government has tried to exert over the education of children.
Hmm. That starts back in the 19th century after the independence from Spain. As early as 1833, I think they passed their first law taking education away from the Catholic Church and putting it under the state. It's education is a religious activity, and they were moving towards statism. And of course, you have to remember the 19th century is after the French Revolution, and all of the philosophers were looking for a way to stop the chaos of anarchy that happened during the French Revolution, but still follow that pattern. Go to anything but God, go to anything but return to the law of the gospel that gave some stability to the world of Christendom. And positivism was a big impact in that. And the first thing they did after Benito Juarez took over, they passed a law in 1867 of public education. That's how they were going to take over education in Mexico, and basically move people away from the church towards the state, away from Christianity towards the state as a source of their law, as a source of their worldview, to make a new Mexican that did not think in terms of Christianity but thought in terms of humanism. And it has worked quite well.
Well, you told me a story that I think ended up in a compliment, although it wasn't intended that way, about what you're accomplishing at the school that you run and the attitude that some of the Mexicans have where they have imbibed statism. Do you want to tell the folks that story?
All about the lawyer, the law teacher. You
Uh, uh,
mean? I think that's the one you're talking about. He, the elite here know what they're doing and know what this is about. The average person just believes it and accepts it. But so they don't. Most people don't really understand exactly what's happened to them or where this is coming from. But a young man that worked with us, has a PhD in economics, and he was going down to a town about 2 hours from here, Tehuacan, to teach on the weekends. And he often rode. His name is Oscar David. And Oscar David would ride down there on the bus, and he'd often ride with this old fellow that taught law, derecho, as they say here. And one day on the way back on the bus, he explained to this old fella what the learning center is about and what we're doing. And the old man got angry and said, "You're raising up an army of little soldiers against the state." Bingo. He understands better than most Christians do what we're about.
and Mexico was not always like that. They were not statists before some of the occurrences that happened in the 1800s that
Hmm.
were informed by the Enlightenment. Do you agree with that?
Yes. Well, we're a mixed bag, We're all of these. As we study the Byzantine Empire as an example, they did a lot of things good, but they codified the Roman humanist law. So it's not always perfect, but we can't be perfectionists. For some reason, God allows this to grow very slowly over lots and lots of generations to accomplish what He wants. But the Spanish Catholics did a lot to leave a legacy of what they called the law of the gospel. They really tried hard to teach people to live according to the Ten Commandments, if you will. And there's a lot of what is believed about what happened here that is just myth.
And we're going to get a little bit more into that later.
Hmm.
And also, I want to talk in that vein, we're going to talk about how uh, North Americans and perhaps other uh, countries in Europe
Hmm.
adversely affected what had been accomplished in Mexico and in Central and South America. But I think
Hmm.
since this is a podcast about justice, and justice as practiced in every area of life, justice towards each other, justice of that governments are responsible for, and justice between nations. So I think we should
Hmm.
define what justice is in terms of God's law. And Roger, how would you define the word justice?
It's a good question because I was thinking about why it seems so hard to define it, and I think the reason is because we have to start with what the standard is. Of course, the Bible says loving your neighbor. Romans chapter 13, 8 through 10 says that loving your neighbor fulfills the law. And I've often thought of that as I was growing up, and I think a lot of Christians do, that if you have some kind of an emotional feeling towards your neighbor, um, the law doesn't apply. But that's not what it means at all. What it's actually saying there is, if you don't harm your neighbor in terms of the law. You don't meddle with his family. You don't commit adultery with his wife. You don't steal his stuff. You don't take his life. That's loving even the guy that drives you nuts, the neighbor that is loud and gross and all that kind of sort of thing, that you don't really like to hang out with him. But how do you love him? By keeping the law towards him. That's the beginning. Now you wrote some notes here and asked me how else do we do, what is justice in what other way? I think that answer is not that complicated. It's blessings and cursings according to the norms of God's law. It's focused on restoring the victim, establishing the facts according to due process, according to God's law, which He lays out those processes in also. And it's not hard if everyone agrees that God's law is the immutable standard. And of course, it starts with faith in God's justice. And I think the issue that we're talking about in this podcast, as I understand it, is what do we do with the part that's been delegated to us, being finite humans and infallible. The part that, so we don't make it as best we can, so we don't make errors. And it has to do with this due process and everybody understanding and agreeing on what those standards are. They're immutable. If you don't, you'll need an expert. You need expert lawyers like we do in the United States now and in Mexico to represent you. The standard will be capricious, and you will not have access to redress of grievance as a victim. It's just we don't have access to judgment here, to justice here in Mexico. We really do not have access to a process of getting justice. In Mexico, under the law that we have right here, you are guilty until you prove yourself innocent, and you can be thrown in jail and just rot there until you can get a hold of somebody that can help you. I got lots of stories about
And,
this. And in fact, injustice rules. It's just the opposite of what we're talking
and
about.
that is a feature of the civil law system that they use, which Europe, with the exception of uh,
Hmm.
Great Britain, uses. Correct?
I think so. Yes, it's the Napoleonic Code kind of an idea where you pass a law you try to pass laws to cover every exigencies, and you leave some uh, space in there for the local bureaucrat to decide. And of course, if the local bureaucrat is unjust, you're going to be stuck, and that you're going to be like the woman, the widow who kept pestering the judge for justice until she got it. It's costly, it's time consuming, and the judges tend to be inhuman in a sense of what's the word I'm looking for? Arrogant and overbearing and tyrants. They just, well, I'm the boss. I'll tell you what the law is.
Well, I know that John Calvin supported the civil law system and was a lawyer trained in that, but there
Hmm.
probably were some developments that came along with different movements, including the Enlightenment, that made the situation worse than it was when Europe was Christianized, more Christianized. Uh,
Hmm.
and I'm sure that a lot of that came over to Mexico after the revolution against Spain and the
Hmm.
impact of other types of movements in that country. And we're going to go back
Hmm.
to that and talk about that a little later. But now I want to focus on another aspect of this because you have alluded to the propaganda that has been generated and used against Mexico. And I'm going to get into that in just a minute. But would you agree, first of all, that nations should act justly towards other nations with respect to foreign affairs?
Yes, that's the thing. I think it's the same norms that ought to govern that activity as to govern individuals.
And if nations employ defamation and propaganda they are not acting in accordance with God's law. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And in fact, the Westminster Confession has some good commentary in the questions and answers concerning the ninth commandment, which we're talking about right now. And how would you expand or expound upon that with respect to what has happened with regard to Mexico and our nation's attitude towards it?
Uh, well, I was thinking you might read that, but it's just absolutely the 144 question 144 is very
And you're talking about the
comprehensive. What are
larger
the duties?
catechism.
Yes, what are the duties required by the ninth commandment? And it's about a paragraph with all kinds of verses to support it. If our State Department were to apply that, actually, I believe the State Department ought to be abolished, and we ought to encourage churches to send missionaries who understand the law and what we're trying to accomplish, not the American system, but Christianity. And that's our biggest problem. We don't act justly because we are not motivated by we have abandoned God and we make our own laws, and it's all about gaining an advantage at whatever cost rather than justice. Our foreign policy is not governed by justice. It's governed by the desire to get an advantage, to make alliances to get an advantage over other people.
Which is a violation of the Ninth Commandment as detailed in the Westminster Confessions
Uh-huh.
and Scripture, correct?
Uh-huh. I think so, yes.
All right. And let's talk about the application of God's law even further. Uh, there has been long been propaganda and collectivist views of what Mexico is like in our country.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk to the folks about what the genesis of that is, just briefly, and how far back it goes, and then let's bring the continuation of that into the present, or at least 150 years ago, because we've got two different things that we're talking about here. We're talking about Hispanic America, but Hispanic America has also been part of Spain in the past until they
Mm-hmm.
broke away from Spain. And the attitudes towards Mexico and the other countries has remained in many respects even after that point in time. Do you want to talk to the folks a little bit about the history of propaganda as used against Hispanic America and Spain?
Sure. I think one of the first things that occurs to me is to try to define propaganda, which is really difficult. There's all kinds of different versions of it, but the one that kind of makes the most sense to me from another book, actually Jacques Ellul's Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes, is an excellent book on propaganda, but he gives up on trying to define it and studies the factors, or what do propagandists do, and fundamentally they try to change people's attitudes to gain an advantage over them, not necessarily telling the truth, telling half-truths, and they do it in a way, and a part of the deal is to do it in a way that people don't even realize it's happening to them. So read a book by Philip Wayne Powell called Tree of Hate that opened my eyes. I heard about it on a podcast or a Easy Chair where R.J. Rush Dooney and Otto Scott interviewed the author of this book. And I understand there's a whole history of how Chalcedon helped him recover the rights to that book to reprint it, because the original publisher published it and printed a bunch of copies and took it off the market. I guess they didn't like the message. But about 3 centuries ago, as a part of a hate campaign towards Spain related to Holland trying to get their independence, you have a whole publishing pamphlets with a one-sided version of the story of what went on in the conquest of Mexico. There was a priest named oh gosh, what was his name?
Casas?
Is de las Casas. Yeah, de las Casas. But Benemedio, I say, what was his first name? Bartolome de las Casas. I should know that by heart. He was actually a pretty good guy, but he wasn't. He had his limits too. There's a little bit of skeletons in his closet as well. And at the time Spain was a leading country, a leading power in the world. They did a lot of good things for a lot of people, and they made a lot of mistakes as well. And so they had this open. The one good thing about Spain is they had this open discussion amongst them. Uh, both sides, kind of like a courtroom, arguing their points, pros and cons, uh, off the chart hyperbole between them, and all of that got picked up in the world, and only the side of Bartolome de las Casas. That's, yes, some of the things he said did happen, but they weren't as extensive as he said they were, and they weren't as bad. They weren't all the time, and there were a lot of good things. All the good things that Spain did in the empire were omitted for propaganda reasons. William of Orange decided to use pamphlets in an effort to gain independence from Spain. And the propaganda pamphlet, which had the widest spread and deepest and most enduring Hispanophobic effect, was Orange's Apology of 1580. And it really was Bartolome de las Casas, what he wrote and what he presented in an argument before the king with another more conservative, I guess the word is conservative, I don't know, it's an apologetic for that. Not everything we're doing is wrong there. So that one got picked up and published all over the place. The English picked it up, the Germans picked it up, the French picked it up. And of course, the Dutch, trying to get independence from Spain, picked it up, and all over the place. And this became the view of Spain. They already had spoken of them as dark people. They had a word marron. So there's a little bit of skin color thing, and mixing with other people's intermarriage between the so-called races wasn't a problem in Spain, and the other nations picked that up and made an issue out of it as well. So you have this big propaganda thing. This is our view to this day. What was in those pamphlets has become what is in the textbooks in the United States of America, and I see that in my own perspective of Latin America. What I had been told is this is a fact, this is how it is that same propaganda. Most missionaries who come here come with that attitude towards Latin America.
Yeah, let me interject something here because I'm going back to the Westminster Confession's larger catechism to question 144. What are the
Mm-hmm.
duties required in the Ninth Commandment? And I'm going to read just the first part of it, but the first part of it says the duties required in the Ninth Commandment are the preserving and promoting of truth between man and the good name of our neighbors as well as our own. So it sounds like we've got
Mm-hmm.
the promotion of mal- being maligning Spain by its European neighbors, and Casas went so far as to malign his own people's names by using hyperbole in his writings, which is also a violation of the Ninth Commandment. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I'm not sure how. I mean, like I said, we're all a mixed bag, and he's painted as some kind of saint that was really concerned with for the indigenous people, and those stories about how they were enslaved and all that sort of thing are really not true. And it's that the Spanish came to Latin America to dig out the gold and go home, and most of the people that came here were middle class people looking for a better life, and there's actually more income generated from cattle and sheep and hides and all those kinds of agricultural activities than there was from the gold and silver. But that's, of course, glitters, and it gets your
Yes, I
attention.
have no doubt that he was probably a very compassionate man, but compassion does not justify maligning people
Absolutely not.
without basis, does it? I mean, we're all sinners,
No,
and
no.
he could never have foreseen what his writings would the kind of hatred his writings would engender against
Mm-hmm.
Spain when he was writing that, I'm sure. And it's especially ironic in light of the fact that the king in Spain was adamant about not enslaving the Indians and passed many rules and laws prohibiting their mistreatment.
Mm-hmm. That's why slavery of Africans never got a foothold in Mexico, and the slavery of the natives. It's typical for this kind of a activity where you're facing a brutal enemy. That the farther you get away from the battlefield, the more sympathetic you are to the enemy. there was some of that going on, but the truth is the truth, the law is the law. And so I think by providence, divine providence, benevolent providence, motivated the king. He hated slavery and he was outraged by it. The soldiers were hired. There, I need to set a stage here. In the first, in the 1500s, that would be the 16th century, the last part of the 16th century, from about 1840 to 1890, there was a war with a
15, you
group
mean
of native
15, not
peoples.
18?
15, I'm sorry, 1540 to 1590, about that time, there was a war with native peoples that was much bloodier than Hernan Cortez's conquest. They were similar to our Comanches and Apaches, probably related. They were called the Chichimeca, and they hired soldiers for a year at a time, and they paid them a soldier's wage, which wasn't very much. And they were mostly cowboys that manned the ranches and dressed up and wore their war gear, and went out together to fight these people to protect the highway to the silver fields on the northwest side of Mexico and in Zacatecas. And they take the captured natives, Chichimeca, and they would sell them to make some more money as slavery. When I got back to the King of Spain, he put a stop to it. And over time, they began to look at ways to be just according to what they understood. I really think they were trying to do what they understood to be God's law, to be fair to these people, and they worked on incorporating them, given the gospel as they understood it, and incorporating them to a society that was governed by the law of the gospel, as they called it.
Well,
So
greed can trump all that kind of thing. And was it not the
yes, he does.
Creoles in Mexico or in Hispanic America, with respect to this Indian tribe, who were kind of driving the attempts to defy Philip's edicts and to enslave Indians? The ones who were
Well,
the Spanish who were actually born in Hispanic America?
uh-huh. Well, there's a mixed bag there. Yeah, I'd say Creoles had something to do with it. The main soldier that was really a hero on the battlefield that helped pacify the Chichimeca was Miguel Caldera, who was one of the first Mixtecas. A mixture of Spanish and Indian. His father was a Spanish miner, and his mother was Chichimeca, from one of the most violent tribes. So yes, I think, as I recall, that's true. They wanted to enslave people, but there was enough force of law to prevent that from happening. And when the king found out about it, he put a stop to it.
And one thing that is different than the history you and I probably learned in school is that the New Spain was not occupied by massive amounts of Spanish troops, was it?
No, it's really interesting how they managed an empire that went from Canada, maybe even Alaska, all the way down to the tip of South America and all the way over to the Philippines with wooden ships and ink. They just wrote letters by hand, and they wrote thousands of pages of reports. They were very disciplined about it. It was part of their culture. And this is how you can imagine, how did all this happen when they didn't have internet and instant email? They wrote letters, and they could put it on a ship, and it went back to the king. And he'd call people back, and they'd be there for months before they came back here. But life goes on. It just keeps moving. And they didn't have forces here except to defend what they had, what was their empire, more from Dutch and English pirates, other pirates, than to try to control the
Yeah,
people.
that's one thing I
They,
find very interesting, and one thing that propaganda seems to be a useful tool or weapon against, and that is that when you demonize a people, then
mhm,
many times things that would generally not be permissible, you might start thinking are permissible, because here we've
mhm.
got this demonization of Spain, and that means that Queen Elizabeth, although she did this with a wink and a nod, did nothing to stop English pirates from attacking and stealing
Hmm.
from the
Well, they
Spanish.
actually commissioned. Well, besides pirates, they were basically pirates that were licensed by the crown, called privateers.
But they were,
Yeah, that was. They were not. I mean, they weren't. They had letters of permission from the crown to go steal stuff from the Spain to go sink Spanish shipping and or take their ships. Basically, do what pirates do, only in the name of the crown, and keep whatever they got.
another thing that I want to talk about in terms of this book that you've been discussing, and I kind of want to expound on it. The actual full name of the book is Tree of Hate, Propaganda and Prejudices Affecting United States Relations with the Hispanic World.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, Philip Wayne Powell was supported by Rushdoony, and in fact, there is a great, easy listening uh, episode, and it's number 147, in which Rushdoony, Otto Scott, and the author all have a discussion about Hispanic America. And one thing
Mm-hmm.
that's very interesting about that is it also discusses how Christianized Hispanic America was. And Rushdoony is actually talking about this, and basically the question comes up: why are we so close to some European countries and other countries when our closest neighbor, or one of our closest neighbor, was a Christian country that we seem to have no esteem for?
Mm-hmm.
And so, do you want to discuss a little bit? And of course, neither you or I are trying to advance Roman Catholicism,
Mm-hmm.
but there were some things unique to Spanish rule in Hispanic America that created something that maybe we didn't learn about in school. You want to expound on that?
Well, I was thinking of one thing. Well, let's go back to the Chichimeca Wars and how they did the pacification. There's a book by Powell called Mexico's Miguel Caldera. In one of the appendices, he put side by side what we did in the West next to what the New Spanish did in Mexico, to go north as we did to go west, facing these violent indigenous tribes. And we would have learned something from them 300 years earlier if we'd have paid attention, but we were too proud and interested in just, we wanted to wipe them out. What the Spanish wanted to do is incorporate it into Christendom. And one of the things they did that was very interesting, an early group of people, an early tribal group that was conquered by Hernan Cortez, became Catholic and very loyal to him, was the Tlaxcalans. There's a little bitty postage-sized state stamp right north of us here in Puebla named Tlaxcala. That's where they were from. And when Hernan Cortez conquered them, they were sacrificing human beings and practicing cannibalism and all that sort of thing. So about in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, long after the conquest, you got several decades there of growth in understanding what Catholicism is. One of the things that the Spanish viceroy decided to do was to negotiate with the Tlaxcalans. How interesting is that? Instead of rounding them up and send them on the Trail of Tears, he negotiated with the Tlaxcalans to send, if they would give him 1,000 people, that is however many families it takes to make up 1,000 people, and that the government would use the treasury of the king to move them up into the area on the northwest of Mexico City, where these Chichimeca Indians were fighting the Spanish, and they were on peyote, and it was just a violent, primitive kind of a people. And they agreed, and the point was to send them with priests so they would have their services, so they would learn God, the law of the gospel, and they would form communities in these areas where the Chichimeca were, and teach them how to cultivate, teach them how to, and by their interactions, how to do commerce, and by their interactions with the Chichimeca, draw them into learning the law of the gospel. And so the system of law and justice was supposed to be based on that concept, which is really basically God's law, is the best they understood it, imperfectly applied, but that was the point. And actually, continued this policy and moved Tlaxcalans up into California and all the way to Texas to try to do the same thing, to civilize, if you will, or Christianize the local people by their interactions with another indigenous group that had become Catholic Christians. Isn't that
That's
interesting?
very interesting. But it's this approach that probably allowed them to build quite an advanced civilization with great universities, great cathedrals, great institutions, and very profitable enterprise in Hispanic America. Would you agree with that?
Yes, yes. It's interesting. They did make, they did coin money and in silver a lot by the thousands, and it's where we actually got our dollar and where the word pieces of eight comes from. But they cut them into eight parts. I can't really tell you the whole history of that story, but it's money. Really interesting. It was a money that wasn't controlled by a central bank. They just made the coins, and they were used for exchange in the United States even.
Well, we've kind of discussed the history of the attitudes that permeated Nordic Europe, Italy, and some of
Mm-hmm.
the other countries in Europe and also England, as well
Mm-hmm.
as during the Spanish rule, as well as America during the Spanish rule of Hispanic America. But when the revolt against Spanish America against Spain came, and Spain the left, some of those attitudes still prevailed in North America and in the United States. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Well, now what exactly what attitudes you mean towards Latin
Well,
America?
the attitudes that we talked about that were engendered by the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
propaganda, and
Mm-hmm.
the particular propaganda characterized the people in a certain way. Uh, you want to expand on that so that the audience knows what we're talking about?
Uh, well, there's a take into account what was going on in the 19th century. There was the Enlightenment's purpose was to rebuild civilization on something, on pure science, and take civilization away from Christendom, away from the law of God, uh, and that influenced the settlers. This Creole people, as you mentioned, I think were probably a big part of that. They were influenced by the currents in Spain, and when they ran the Spanish out and destroyed their credibility intellectually, the Mexican leaders, the Mexican elite, turned to France with their French Revolution. It's really ironic that the French came here and conquered uh, Mexico and ruled it by a under 30-year-old Emperor Maximiliano and his wife Carlota, both of them under 30 years old, for three years. And Mexico beat them on the battlefield. But right away, when Benito Juarez took over, and a lot of his confiscation of the church's property is an example of the propaganda, vilifying the church, when it was really more like a French Revolution, confiscating the land of the church and killing priests and trying to unchristianize the country. His point was to try to unchristianize, de-Christianize Mexico, if you will. So when the first thing he did was to get a group of philosophers, and one of the principal ones, a fellow named Gabino Barreda, which Rushdoony has also written about. It's very interesting. I've done a lot of study of the positivist movement in Mexico, and they took over the educational system. Where did Gabino Barreda get his training to change the worldview of Mexicans? From Auguste Comte, the founder of, or the main guy in this philosophy of positivism, a Frenchman, and he went to Paris and learned it. So they beat the French on the battlefield, but the French beat them in the area of philosophy and worldview. And today, I would say Mexico is not as Catholic as we think it is. It's more secular humanist, and that's an influence of the of this positivist, socialist, collectivist, statist philosophy that continues to this day. They're highly influenced by it, whether they want to, they say maybe it's past and it's something in the past and it failed, but they're really positivists at heart, just like our legal system since Oliver Wendell Holmes. It's very similar. It's whatever we say is, whatever science tells us is, that's what's right and wrong. But the only thing science can tell you about right and wrong is what is right. That's the best you can get, and that's exactly what they want to do. So, in this sense, I would like to throw in a couple of. You were going to ask me something, I think, about the certain Americans that had an influence in this in our foreign
Right,
policy.
right.
Most
And one thing I want to
Americans,
make clear is I'm
yeah,
not only talking about the attitudes in, say, Mexico or the other Hispanic American countries. I am also talking about the attitudes that Americans have, or North Americans, people who
mm,
live in the United States, have had
yeah,
toward the Hispanic people. A lot of that, which comes from the things that were described in the Tree of Hate with regard to the propaganda campaign that
mm-hmm,
lingered. And I can tell you, I grew up in Texas, and I know that the attitudes towards the Mexicans, when I study the history of the Texas Rangers and what went on at the border in the early 1900s. In fact, my grandmother's stepfather was in the cavalry with Captain Black Pershing and
mm,
chasing Pancho Villa.
blackjack,
And I think the
mm-hmm,
attitude has long been, and some of this I think is hyperbolic and influenced by tradition, is that Mexicans were banditos and did
mm-hmm,
not work hard. And I don't know where they got all that, but it's certainly antithetical to what Spain built at that time, prior to that.
mm-hmm. I have some relatives in Texas that we are highly influenced by our personal experiences. So there were banditos and there were depredations and there were all of that stuff went on, but that doesn't mark all of Latin America. And our error is to put everybody in a basket and treat them all the same instead of dealing with individuals in court according to God's law, which is very personal, very personally oriented, restoration of the victim. I think that's where we get off track. And so there were some things that went on across the border with Texans, but Texans have been living with Mexicans, and actually, first Texans came to Mexico, came to Texas by the invitation of the Mexican government as a obstacle to help them control the Comanche, which were raiding deep into Mexico, Mexican territory. So that's really interesting. That's where you get that "come and get it"
Right,
flag in Texas. And actually, it was a war when Santa Anna came up and fought the settlers in Texas. He was fighting against his own
right,
citizens, not against
right.
Americans. That's a misnomer of the history. That's another part of the history we don't understand. But way back in the 1800s, early 1800s, our very first ambassador to Mexico had been a senator, Mexico and Central America. He was the ambassador to Mexico and Central America. His name was Joel R. Poinsett. He's from I think from South Carolina. And he introduced the Masons to Mexico and got Benito Juarez and several other elitists that were into the French positivism to have secret meetings. They had secret meetings in New Orleans, making their plans for exactly what they did after they gained power. And one of his purposes was to get more states from Mexico that were pro-slavery into the United States to gain political power against the states that didn't want to continue with slavery. So it's really interesting how that happened. When they discovered, when the central government, our government, discovered what he was doing, they recalled him. But the momentum had started, and Benito Juarez is famous for being a Mason, and that's a whole study in itself. It's really interesting. But so he was one of the first guys. The interesting thing is he had a hobby of being a botanist. So he stole what they call the Flor de las Pascuas in Central America, and they call it La Noche Buena here, and put his name on it. That's why we call it the poinsettia.
Wow. Well, what
Mm-hmm.
we've got here is two different dynamics going on at the same time. First of all, we've got the underlying attitudes of a broad section of the people of a country and their attitudes towards other countries, and then we've also
Mm-hmm.
got the agendas of foreign governments.
Mm-hmm. And I think, well, there's another story that moves this thing forward. I think it helps to understand the currents, the political currents in the United States, and what was driving this. we were going more and more. I heard the other night, I was listening to Rushdoony, he commented that there was a socialist movement in the United States, a movement before Marx ever wrote his book. And there was, it's interesting to study the history of the politics that led the progressive era in the United States. So we're moving in that direction. So you got a movement from government that is really starts in the family and is primarily in the family to a government that is statist, and that's where you get these problems. It's always the elitists that start wars, and family to family, most of us get along very well. And when we ask for justice, when an individual treats us badly or steals from us or murders a family member, but this whole thing about putting all peoples in a basket, it's state to state. It's a civilization where the state is everything. It's Aristotle's ethics, Aristotle and Plato's politics writ large. So at the end of the 19th century, there was an author that is I like his stuff. I like his writings. Is O. Henry. He was actually a Texan. He lived
In
in
Austin.
Texas anyway. Yeah, and he embezzled money from a bank, about $25,000, I think, from a bank in Galveston. And when he's about to go to jail, he beat feet for Honduras that we didn't have an extradition treaty with us, and he stayed there for 6 years. When he heard that his wife was sick and dying, he came back and stayed with her until she passed away, and then turned himself in. Spent, I think, another 6 years in jail in Texas, probably. And that's where he started his writing career and gave himself that pseudonym. I can't remember what his real name is, but he wrote a story about his experiences in Honduras that was supposed to be humorous, just humorous. But it was called Of Cabbages and Kings. It's quite long. It's like a novella almost. And there's still things in there that I experienced that I saw, little cultural bits and pieces that he writes about that were at his time there that I saw when I was in Honduras in the 90s. But this book was published, this story was published about the time that we wanted to go to war with Spain, where we, remember the Maine and
The USS Maine,
Teddy
yes.
Rose, yeah, and that probably was a false flag kind of a thing we think now, and we wanted to, in the Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders and all of that those legends and myths about that thing, and so the jingoistic press at the time picked that up and published it in their press as if that were the truth. And so that's where part of the reason why we have this idea of the lazy Latin wearing his big sombrero, sitting on the tree asleep while the revolution goes off in his ears. One revolution after another, but we have actually supported and contributed to that.
Yeah, let's move forward in time. We've talked about what America did in the 1800s, and let's go into the 20th century with
Mm-hmm.
regard to Mexico, which there was a revolution in the 1910s.
Mm-hmm. 1910 and
Yeah, the
1920.
1920s. And I think there is an abject story of the tragic results of our attitude towards Mexico and our relations with
Mm-hmm.
Mexico. And I think a book that is really great that talks a lot about this and also talks about the Masonic influence and that sort of thing is No God Next Door,
Mm-hmm.
Red Rule in Mexico and Our Responsibility. And it's by Michael Kinney, who was a Catholic priest. And in fact, when this book came out, it was suppressed for in fact, I don't even know if it can be bought in Mexico at the present time. Perhaps it can. But even in the United States, and this was written in the 1930s, but in the United States, FDR somehow convinced the Catholic Church to pull the book from its shelves. So for 70 years, it was not available for purchase in the United States. And you've read that book
Mm-hmm.
too. Uh, and I'd like you to kind of discuss what what was the result in the 20th century of what had happened previously with our interventions
Mm-hmm.
in Mexico or our influences in Mexico up until the time that this book was written.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's first of all, if the story of Joel Poinsett, and then the jingoistic press going against the Spanish, and using that sort of propaganda ideal rather than investigating it and knowing anything about Spanish, tracks with our own movement towards of our elite towards a statist progressivist ideal. So the promise of utopia of the positivists in the 19th century failed, and there was a president for 30 years named Porfirio Diaz, those Porfiriatos, and he used to say, "Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States," or I think maybe it was around the other way around, so close to the United States and so far from God. And he accepted running for president one too many times, and so in 1910, when he became the president one more time, there was a revolt, and of course it starts with the elite, and they start a civil war, and that civil war lasted for 10 years, and 2 million Mexicans died at the hand of their compatriots, and that's when Blackjack Pershing went into Mexico after uh, Pancho Villa, and because he was crossing the border into Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and raiding and all that sort of thing. So that is very bloody. And in 1917, they wrote their first constitution out of this new revised thing. And Otto Scott, in that interview with William Payne,
Powell.
William
Yeah.
Philip Wayne Powell that you mentioned, said that the Constitution of Mexico of 1970 was the first communist constitution in the history of the world. It's very interesting. So you get after that, you move forward. You get the party called the Permanent Revolution Party, the Partido Revolucionario Institucionado, the PRI. My Spanish and English are confusing each other, so I can't pronounce things right. The PRI has dominated politics in Mexico for 70 years. And it's interesting because they said it was an institutionalized revolution. How do you have an institutionalized revolution? That's a whole other topic. It's interesting to talk about what the philosophy is behind that. So in the 20s, the Calles regime tried to completely make atheists by force of arms out of the Mexican people. So they confiscated land, they limited the number of priests, they killed priests, they started hanging people off of poles, telephone poles, campesinos that resisted him, and there was a movement that rose up against them that was actually quite successful. Gotiari, I think, was the name of the general that stood up and organized these people, and they were called the Cristeros. And that they made a deal for peace, and of course the government went against it, and they hung people that had been with the Cristeros after promising them amnesty. And the interesting thing is, the Cristeros were looking for help from anybody to give them arms to continue to fight, and we had an opportunity to help them, and we didn't. We stopped it. We resisted that, and a lot of it had to do with negotiation with the government for our corporate interests, who they had confiscated the land from, oil interests and that sort of thing. And lots has to do with loans to Mexico from banks and protecting their assets. And so we're interested in materialism and in gaining an advantage, and we're interested in propaganda instead of truth in order to get a materialistic advantage. So we're not following God's laws of justice in Mexico. We apparently didn't care. And in the 30s, this thing continues. You have one of our ambassadors just fawned all over this government that was attempting to continue to atheize Mexico, to completely wipe out the influence of the church. Am I on
Yeah,
track
yeah,
from what you
and
read?
I think it's that ambassador who's dramatized in the great movie For the Greater Glory, where he is on a
Mm-hmm.
train with some of the, I can't remember if it was the president or who it was, uh, smoozing it up, and they
Mm-hmm.
pass in that train. They pass a whole bunch of poles with peasants hung from
Mm-hmm.
them,
They look
who
like
were, yeah,
telegraph
from the
poles. Yeah.
telegraph
Mm-hmm.
poles. And although the ambassador was shocked, instead of looking to his Christian conscience, he did the
Mm-hmm.
will of the state. and
Mm-hmm.
defied God's law and just continued on
Mm-hmm.
the relationship with uh, the Mexican government at that time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But and what this caused was the destruction of church, uh, destruction of family, and destructions of other kinds of institutions. And I'll tell you, one of the things that really hit me about this book was what they were doing with the children. The children could no longer go to the private parochial schools, and I don't know if they had other kinds of
Mm-hmm.
private schools, but they were forced to be educated by the state. And not only were they
Mm-hmm.
forced to be educated by the state, but the state took an active interest in destroying their characters, their moral characters.
Mm-hmm.
And do you want to discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, that was after the Calles and the Cristeros. The whole thing, governments, people, they don't have control unless people cooperate with them. Conspiracies don't work unless there's already a market for what they want to offer. So there was a certain amount of that there, and it continued on in the 30s. But the governments put on the pressure or take off the pressure depending on how much support they get from the people. And there's a lot of resistance. They'll try more
Well,
subtle ways.
I
So
want
they're
to
going
get
to
to
educate
this particular point. So let me direct you
this
because
thing. This.
we're we've done this for a very long time, and we're going to have to wrap up in a
Mm-hmm.
little while. But the thing that jumped out to me is when they were educating these children, they were
Mm-hmm.
giving them sex education, which
Mm-hmm. Yes, they made
undermines the
them.
foundations, and they were actually making these
Mm-hmm.
children in mixed classrooms undress in front of each other. So why don't you comment about
Mm-hmm.
that?
Now, that was all over. That was in several places where, of course, we're in Mexico City, and is where things start often. And there was a governor in Chiapas that did that, made the children undress, boys and girls, teenagers, undress in front of each other, and it was to remove the Christian morality. And of course, people that are addicted to sex are easy to control. There's a whole book about that that's fascinating. You ought to read, called Libido Dominandi, uh, sex, sexual sex as a means of political control. And that's very typical of these regimes. It's way back to the worship of Moloch and
Yeah,
before.
that's by E. Michael
Uh,
Jones.
yes, that's a good book. It's a long one, and it's like watching a horror movie, but it's worth reading. And you're not going to agree with everything because he's very Catholic and very anti-Protestant. But a lot of what he presents is worth understanding, and that's what's happened to us in the United States. So there was an actual effort to do that. They had clubs for kids that met on Sundays when they would have probably gone to catechism or some kind of mass or something, and they had them chanting, and in the schools, there is no God, there is no God,
Well, this reminds me of
and
our
yeah.
public education system in the United States, especially with regard to sexual morality, because ever since sex
Mm-hmm.
education came in, there has been an undermining of the Christian
Mm-hmm.
character and the Christian view towards sex. And just,
Mm-hmm.
you know, what kids learn decreases their modesty. It causes them to
Mm-hmm.
push envelopes until they are easy to control because they develop addictions and their attention is diverted from more important things into something that is not
Mm-hmm.
categorized by them properly in the biblical sense.
Yes, right. Of course, it sounds real moral because you're trying to prevent pregnancies and all that kind of stuff. Actually, promoting pregnancies is promoting sexual deviancy, and that's exactly the purpose is control. And the elite that practice those things project that onto the rest of the population, as saying they want, if we're the deplorables if we don't go along with their sexual mores. So that's exactly what's happened and what has happened here. And the family, we still have a strong affinity for the family in Mexico, but it's falling apart. And for this very same, lots of divorce, lots of machistas. Okay, Rushduni, I think it was, said that feminism is the demand to have the same rights to your responsibility as machismo does.
Right. Well, there's two other little topics I want to discuss with you based
Mm-hmm.
on your study and your experience with regard to Mexico as well as the other countries in Hispanic America. But let's
Hmm.
particularly look at Mexico. I want to discuss the North American Christian Church's response to the debacle of the Mexican Revolution and, and
Hmm.
the creation or the writing of that communist uh, constitution that started off the persecution of the Catholic Church and essentially wholesale looting of Catholic churches. And
Well, that looting of the Catholic Church started way back in the 19th century. Benito Juarez
oh,
did that
okay.
first. Hmm.
And when was it that there was a period of time though that a leader in Mexico took those confiscated church properties because they weren't just looting the churches, they were also taking the entire physical churches, and they were giving them to Protestant missionaries from the United States. When
I think Benito Juarez in the 19th century started that, and that's the oldest Protestant seminary in Latin America is the Presbyterian Seminary in Mexico City. It was founded in 1880, during all of that time when that was happening. So as I understand, he even had some Protestant Christian. How Protestant are we? How Christian are we? There's tares among the wheat. So that actually commanded forces for him and supported him, because part of the reason is because we've been taught that the Catholics are our enemy, our primary enemy. Really, humanism is our primary enemy. I actually pray for the Catholic Church to be reformed once a week.
well,
So I have a lot of
my
friends. I have a lot of friends who are
my
Catholics. Go
understanding
ahead.
from Tree of Hate, according to Powell, is that he said that in the 1500s, when they were beginning their empire over there, they had already started reforming the Spanish Catholic Church with many of the reforms that
Hmm.
Luther was concerned about.
It was a counter-reformation, and it kind of went in a different direction. And of course, the Council of Trent that formed the modern Catholic Church was started 3 years before Luther died, and they were trying to deal with these things. And what they actually, the weakness of that whole reform movement was they actually codified the errors of the medieval Catholicism towards the end of the era that Luther and the rest of the reformers revolted against. Some, worship of Mary and all that sort of thing, where that's the weakness. But they did a lot of things to try to reform the abuses.
What I really wanted to get back to was the idea that Christians would come to Mexico or go to Mexico and take over properties that they knew were stolen from the Catholic Church. What is your take on that?
Well, if you think that the Pope is the Antichrist, you're doing a favor to the kingdom to do that, don't you think? And then you had this whole movement of the positivists, the pietistic Christians. You read about that in Murray Rothbard's book, the Progressive Area. That's a fascinating book about the politics of the United States. So you have to take all of those pieces together and try to get them together and say, well, why would they do that? It's because they really were statist Christians. A lot of these Protestants, and then you have the pietistic, the dispensationalists. A lot of our missionaries that have come to Mexico have been more anti-Catholic than pro God's law, and they have been. We're waiting for a rapture. We're going to get out of this place, so we don't have anything that we're not supposed to say anything about the way the country is run or the politics or the economics. That's just the way it is, and we're going to get the pick the brands out of the fire and get them into heaven. And when they die, they'll go to heaven. But changing the culture of Mexico is not in our bailiwick. So our statement of what our purpose is to build the intellectual foundation of the future Christian civilization in Mexico is a radical departure from the missionary currents for, I'd say, over 100 years here.
So basically, they came into Mexico and gave deference to a government that they had to know was in all sorts of ways trying to destroy the influence of God's law.
Well, they didn't know that because they were cut of the same cloth, so they actually agreed with it. Their thinking was very much of the same kind of, well, we can be Christians, and this guy's doing good things because he's stopping the Catholic Church and and much of the propaganda about the Spanish conquest of the empire And so why wouldn't we support it? If we really believe that, that's what we've been taught, that's what we've been propagandized to believe. So I'm not sure that they should have known that, because their worldview was really distorted Christianity.
I see. Well, what might we conclude from this sad story about what North America's approach to foreign affairs, using propaganda and demonization of people and countries? And what do you think the Christian approach should have been?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that that's a product of statism, not of Christianity. We still had the language, we still used the vocabulary of holiness, but we had abandoned God's law as the guide for how we ought to be running the country. What I think should have happened is we shouldn't have had an ambassador from the federal government into Mexico. We should have encouraged the churches to send missionaries. And one of the things that Poinsett did that was wrong was to try to encourage Mexico to copy the United States. And the president at the time, who was eventually assassinated, I think, said it's not going to work here, because we have this. What he described was actually more like the idea of how Israel was governed. There was a central government, but it was spread out, and most of the government was done at the local area. There was centers where the Catholic Church had teaching, where that was like a Levitical function, but everything outside of that was free. You got 5 acres, I think, if you were a man on foot, and if you had oxen, you could have 20 acres or something like that. But that was your land. You went out and populated it, and you got your training about how you were supposed to be living, the ethics of life, when you went to the church. And they had schools there, basically what would amount to Catholic schools. And we demonize them, but we never look at the facts of what good they did. Well, how God actually, this is providence. This is not lifting up the Catholic Church or shooting holes at all of the Protestants. It's saying God's providence has allows us to make our mistakes and pay our consequences for it, but he also keeps moving his kingdom forward. It's like a ratchet. It goes forward and then it comes back some, but it never goes back all the way. So we are progressing. And because Christ is sovereign over Mexico, I have a lot of hope for the future of Mexico. I'm not sure that I answered your question, but
I
that's
think what you've answered is the next question I was going to ask you is how Christian Reconstruction, or other movements are advancing the kingdom in
mhm.
Mexico.
Well, the spirit is moving here, because I keep bumping into people that have become advocates of God's law. I'd say faith for all of life more than using the terms theonomy and reconstruction, because those aren't so polemic and they're understandable. Everybody, who could disagree with that? But that's what it's about. And so there's people all over that are translating books. A young man that I performed his wedding this summer, and he's already expecting a child. God, that's how we conquer Mexico, is marry Christian families and Christian couples, and they have children, and they raise them up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. So that's really hopeful. But he sends me copies, pages, pictures in Facebook Messenger of pages that he's translating with stuff highlighted. He says, I don't understand what this means. So I have to stop and go and help him and explain it to him. And I have to read the context and so forth. So there's all of this kind of stuff is going on under the surface, and there is an awakening. There's everybody uses internet. Everybody is connected with each other. So there's a skepticism about how the state, as the God of Mexico, the state really is the God of Mexico, not Catholicism, not the God of Catholicism, but the state that permits this is more like the Roman Empire. So there's a movement and awakening, and there's hunger to say, what's the answer? This isn't working. So I think those are all very positive
That's good.
movements. Yeah. So, and then I think, you think about what did the positivists do in the 19th century? First thing you did was take over the education system. What's the easiest thing to do right now as a missionary is to start a school. People come to our school by word of mouth because they're fed up with the public education system. They're fed up with bullying. They're fed up with teaching 5-year-olds about gender confusion and about homosexuality. And they don't want Christians do not want their children to grow up in that. They don't understand anything else. They don't understand the rest of the story, but they don't want that. So they hear about our school and they come to our school because the atmosphere is different. We teach God's law. We repeat the Ten Commandments every morning, say the Lord's Prayer. They memorize Scripture. And so the school end up becoming a ministry to families, not just to the kids, because we have a school of the fathers about 3-4 times a year, and I teach basically theonomy and reconstruction, faith for all of life. Why do we have this school? Why should you send your kids here? Why should you not send them to the public school? Why should you not worry that you're about the propaganda, the intimidation of the state, that your kids will not be able to get a job if they don't get a degree from the system in Mexico? We have ways around that. That doesn't, we always figure that out. But I always challenge the parents, when you come to the Learning Center, it's got to be a calling. You have to understand what they have to understand what the doctor of laws that I was talking about in the first place, that we're raising up an army of little soldiers against the state. They don't carry arms. Their weapon is applying God's law to every area of life with themselves and their families first. And when that becomes to have a movement, then the Mexicans will produce a change, will demand a change in the government. You don't change the government to change the people. You change the people to change the government.
And I think this sad story that you've told and that is told in The Tree of Hate by Philip Wayne Powell, No God Next Door,
Mm-hmm.
and also you mentioned the book called Darrow, which is also by Philip Wayne Powell,
Mm-hmm.
as well as the book Libido Dominati. I think all of those things can point us forward in what our present foreign affairs and foreign policy should be
Mm-hmm.
with regard to any other country in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree with that?
Yep.
All right, well, Roger, I want to thank you so much for being on the show. And I also want to announce that Roger will be continuing on this podcast as a co host with me in the future.
That's a
I hope.
scary thought.
Are you kidding? I think it's a great thought. I hope everyone enjoyed this and learned from it, and will join us for the future podcasts. And I want to say goodbye from Justice in His Kingdom until next time.